Okay, I am sorry to remind you that we're not going to be talking about HRT today. That's kind of a whole different ball game. If you haven't already figured it out by what the other speakers have said up until now, what we want you to learn is that you can do other things to help balance hormones. You don't have to jump right into hormone replacement. In fact, that is often the wrong thing to do. I'm one of the few people that tell you who I'm associated with. I am actually involved with Gaia Herbs because I am a trained herbalist as well. All right, we've got a lot of things to cover. The first thing we're going to be talking about is just hormone balance, common signs and symptoms. Oh, I do want to say one thing. You'll notice that as I'm going through the presentation, there are some slides that you see in your slide deck that I've hidden. That's mostly for the sake of time and also because they're pretty self-explanatory. And there's a bunch of stuff at the end that are references and additional information as an appendix. So if you looked ahead and saw how many slides we have to cover, don't freak out. There's still a lot, but all right. These are the general common concerns that I see in my practice every day because although I do see men, I primarily still see women. And if you'll notice, a lot of these common concerns of hormone imbalance in women of all ages kind of cover the whole gamut of the matrix. It's not simply the hormone node. This was the way I was trained to think. Whenever I thought about hormone imbalance, it was just how's the brain talking to the ovaries and then what are the ovaries saying to the uterus? And one would, and this, I don't mean to sound like I'm bashing how I was originally trained, but it was pretty limited because you would think that as gynecologists, we would be the experts in balancing hormones. But what they literally taught me was you either suppress them or you do surgery. And that's really pretty much it. So now you've seen this slide before and you understand that everything talks to everything and that it's actually this big long thing, HPATGIG axis. Basically, just remember everybody talks to everybody and you can't leave anybody out of the picture. That's the easiest way to remember it. Men and women are both affected by all of these principles, but honestly, you know, guys are pretty simple, relatively speaking. Women are a lot more complex. And I like to put this slide up for a couple of reasons. It reminds you, first of all, about everything that happens throughout a woman's cycle, you know, what the FSH does, when the LH kicks in, all of that. But look closely at the colors, because this is actually the point of the slide. It's to get across not only the interwoman variability of any given hormone during a cycle, but also the variability within a cycle for, you know, one cycle to the next within the same woman, or one cycle versus another cycle depending on where she is in her reproductive life. So you end up with this average, which is that dark blue line in the middle, which kind of doesn't really mean anything if you look at it closely because it's not getting you the picture of how complex all the variability is. This slide is sort of the same thing. Don't worry about the details. This is actually a staging system that was developed for things that happen throughout the menopausal transition. And the red line is basically all I want you to remember. It starts off with, you know, just some sort of basic transitions up and down, and then it goes haywire, and there's huge variability as you progress. That's really all you need to remember. Symptoms happen at the time of changing hormone levels, not at absolute levels. So be really careful about doing something silly and saying, okay, I just drew this blood level on you and you're normal, so you can't be having any symptoms. Because she knows that she doesn't feel good. So it's about time of changing levels, not absolutes. Because it's complex and because it varies so much, what we're trying to teach you here is looking for pattern recognition. Looking at symptoms, aided by some hormone measurements perhaps, but mostly looking at symptoms and understanding what the different patterns are that would explain to you how to proceed with treatment. And let's put it into the picture of the functional medicine tree. Essentially, what you need to remember is that, come on, pay attention. This is not advancing, there we go. Women's hormone symptoms, these are all the different conditions and symptoms. That's important, but those are like the twigs and the leaves. They're way out on the periphery. And if you look at the initial branches, those are the patterns of hormone imbalance. And then the roots and the trunk are the lifestyle change and the ATMs. You have to remember to keep the roots and the trunk stable and balanced, or you're never going to be able to keep the leaves balanced. If that helps you kind of wrap your head around how to do this. You've probably already, I think you've already seen this. This is just to point out that female and male hormones, there are receptors all over the body, and they interact with all of the other symptoms, the other systems, and pretty much have effect throughout the matrix, which is why actually we do hormones on day 4 and not on day like 1 or 2, because you have to understand the other parts of the matrix first. The communication node is essentially a matrix within a matrix. Okay, think of it that way. And so yes, you have to balance the communication node and all of the conversation with the hormones and each other, but you also have to keep track of the full matrix. And we're going to go through the Go To It model and the PTSD mnemonic just to help you stay organized. You've already seen this. What disrupts hormone imbalance? Well, pretty much everything. And these are all the things you have to keep in mind when you're having a conversation with someone about her hormone imbalance. And it really, you'll get funny looks from patients because they want to talk about their hot flashes and you're talking to them about, now, food they get and exercise they get, but when you start asking them about their bowel habits, they'll give you a really weird look. So you have to explain like why you're doing this, and you know, by the time you filled out the matrix with them, then they kind of start to understand. And there's another diagram that we're going to get to later in the talk that I literally show people because even though it's a lot of biochemistry, it helps them understand what we're doing. So these are the important questions to keep in mind and to ask your patient as you're moving through the conversation trying to gather data. When was the last time you felt good? I always ask people that because they think that's important, and you're maybe the first person who's ever asked them that question. Don't ever ask them whether or not they're stressed. I mean, they'll just kind of look at you funny. Ask them what new is going on with their stress. Although, I think Keisha mentioned this earlier today, there are lots of my patients who will say, oh, I'm not stressed. You know, I'm doing stuff, I'm busy, but I'm doing stuff I love. I've got that great life. Well, she doesn't even recognize it as stress because she's gotten so adapted to it, but she's the person who wakes up thinking, running, goes to sleep, running and thinking. So don't just, you have to be careful how you ask the stress questions. Make sure you ask about all kinds of hormones that they've had at any point in their life. Synthetic hormones, thyroid, contraceptive pills, different medications because antibiotics and cholesterol-lowering agents, reflux meds, NSAIDs, all of these are important and will impact their hormone balance. Surgeries. Obviously, oophorectomy is pretty important to know. Tubal ligations, which are not actually on this list, that can have an impact on a woman's hormones as well. Make sure if she's had a cholecystectomy, you find out as much detail as you can because you'll see in a little bit about how that may impact her excretion of the hormones. And then obviously ask about fertility issues and infertility drugs that have been used in the past, especially the drug levels that they were using when the women who are currently menopausal were trying to get pregnant because things have sort of changed. Make sure that you also ask about endocrine disrupting chemicals. There is a toxin exposure questionnaire in the toolkit. Use it if it seems appropriate. And you can kind of know, based on where they live, what they do. So the patients in my practice who are hairdressers, for instance, or the people who do nails, they are going to have issues because of the drugs that the chemicals they're exposed to. Got to talk to them about bowel function. Obviously have to talk to them about their diet, but in not just like the macros, but find out, are they concerned about organics? Or, do they do a lot of things that may give them glyphosate exposure, that sort of thing. Got to talk to them about their alcohol use. Ask them questions about methylation. If you have savvy patients, a lot of my patients are savvy, they already know their methylation status by the time I see them. But if you don't know that, you can ask them about mood disorders, cancer in the family, birth defects, that sort of thing, and it'll give you an idea. Absolutely positively, you have to talk to them about abuse. 1 in every 3 women has been abused. And that, Keisha talked about how that impacts hormones over time. And then obviously you also have to get into dental work. That has to do with exposures. Stress, I talk all day long about stress because the average woman has spent about 18 or 20 years taking care of kids, another 15 to 20 years taking care of older parents or in-laws. Most women are working while they're doing this. This study said that we work an hour more than men. I'm thinking it might be more than that. But this woman kind of reminds me a little bit of Shiva. That would be okay if she were a Hindu god. We've talked at great length about cortisol steal, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that right this minute. But do remember that this is super important when it comes to balancing hormones, and if you forget to look and take that into account, you're going to miss the boat. So, here's a big question for you. What is the largest cause of morbidity and mortality in women aged 16 to 45? Anybody know? Shout it out if you know. It's violence. Primarily violence at home, primarily sexual abuse. It cuts across all socioeconomic barriers in all races. Like I said, 1 in 3 women, and that would be, in this group as well. Men, I think it's more like 1 in 6. So imagine what it's like being the typical busy person and then even home is not safe. So that's important to keep in mind when you ask patients about it, and you may be the first person who's ever come right out and actually asked. Now, I have a question on my intake form about abuse, and if I see that someone skipped that, that should be a red flag that you chose not to answer. So that what you'd have to delve into. This is why mind-body interventions are important. And sometimes they don't really want to talk about it, which is understandable, but I simply point these things out to them. Stress, increased cortisol, lowers progesterone and increases estrogen effect. Increased spent cortisol is going to increase inflammation. And increased cortisol increases insulin resistance, which increases aromatase. This whole picture messes with ovarian hormone balance. So if you can see her getting a little nervous, not wanting to talk about it, or just getting teary-eyed, you can explain to her the biochemistry just in these couple of quick sentences and say, this is why it's important that I at least need to know that it happened. I don't need to know the details necessarily. And you may not feel trained to take care of this, in which case, know your community and who you can refer to. But please don't just skip over it. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about toxins and xenohormesis. This is basically about how different chemically modified food ingredients and foreign chemicals and all impact the hormonal response. So what are we talking about? These are the usual things: pesticides like atrazine and glyphosate, plastics and plasticizers, and just a comment about plasticizers, which are almost always the phthalates. Did you guys know that they put phthalates in the coating of supplements and pharmaceuticals that need to be enteric coated? And I will give a shout out to one of our exhibitors. That company had a product out, came out about, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, and it's for hormone balancing, and it was enteric coated. And I'm reading the ingredient label, and I went, oh, there's phthalates in here. And I had to comment to a couple of different people in the company, but they took it out. So I'll give them credit for that. But you have to take this kind of thing into account. Cosmetics and personal care additives are a big deal. Now, for those of you that really want to go into the weeds on this topic, this publication, it's kind of old. I mean, it's 10 years old at this point, but it's free and it's online, and the data hasn't shifted. There's really good, strong evidence for these endocrine disrupting chemicals in terms of fetal malformations, thyroid dysfunction, neuroendocrine disruption, obesity, you name it. So if you ever need the underlying research data, this is a good place to go looking. And this is another really good resource, The Toxin Solution by Dr. Pizzorno. And his is sort of aimed more at a doable, let's go fix this sort of a thing. Now, the average baby has over, now this is probably this is old data. I have a feeling this number is probably higher at this point, but the average baby has over 200 chemicals in their cord blood, so they obviously haven't even been out in the world yet and they're already exposed. The interesting thing as well is that we know that breast milk has consistently been shown to have toxins in it, even if you eat a fairly healthy diet and you try to limit exposures. And I really always hate to bring this up, but I've always wondered if that has something to do with why women who have lactated and breastfed have lower incidence of breast cancer. I mean, we do know that it has to do with changes in the breast tissue itself, but maybe we're just offloading our toxins. Not to say don't breastfeed. I still want you to breastfeed, but isn't it kind of concerning? All right. A couple of comments about Roundup, glyphosate, because this is one of my pet peeves. It has been labeled a probable carcinogen 4.5 years ago by the World Health Organization. It is ubiquitous. It is put on more than just genetically modified food products. It's also put on other food products at the very end to just sort of knock down the field so that they can go through and harvest more easily. And these are a couple of different slides of the use of Roundup and a couple of different things like the number of kids with autism that have been diagnosed and renal and pelvic cancers and senile dementia, and they pretty much go together. So I think it's important. A quick comment about the Environmental Working Group and their subsection page called Skin Deep. This is a really great resource to go in and look up the skincare products and personal care products that you personally use or your patients use, and you can see how bad they are. There's some good ones, but not a lot. And I think that this is something that you really have to talk to people about because it's something that it's kind of, I know a lot of people who are on the fence about, well, I need to look a certain way, but I do want to keep my liver happy and I don't want to screw with my hormones. So just have them look it up and they might be able to at least find things that are a little less concerning. Remember, in the center of the matrix, this is all about spirituality and emotional and mental situations. For women, this is primarily an issue of sexual identity, their feelings of self-worth and value, and as I'm sure you're all aware, this can be very problematic for a lot of women. They may look really cool, calm, and together on the surface, and this is still an issue. So this is where the whole mind-body hormone picture comes together, and so don't forget to explore this with your patients as well. We've already talked about the mnemonic stains. I just want to bring it up again. This is a way for you to remember to ask them about everything and not skip anything by accident. So stress, toxins, the A is allergens, antigens, autoimmune, the infections, nutrition, and then sleep and being sedentary. Okay. Let's talk about the actual patterns at this point. Estrogen dominance. Well, estrogen dominance, think aromatase, think inflammation, think environmental sources of toxins. This, and we're going to talk more about this in just a little bit in detail. Luteal phase dysfunction. This is more not just not producing enough progesterone. This is also adrenal issues and cortisol steal. Fluctuation in hormone levels, well, this can happen kind of anytime. You know, this could be normal menstrual cycling, PMS or PMDD, perimenopause. It could be secondary to illness or major life stressors. Another pattern is hormonal insufficiency. Think menopause or perimenopause. Think iatrogenic low hormones, chemotherapy, surgeries. Think also premature ovarian failure. It's not common, but I have a bunch of patients in my practice with it. And then also think suboptimal hormone metabolism, and we're going to go into detail about that as well. Here it's about nutrition and genetics primarily. So to get back to the PTSD, how to go about this. Let's start with the production of hormones. Diet inflammation, aromatization, and exogenous estrogens. Now, this has already been gone over, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But the estrogen production, you have to remember during reproductive years, that's primarily produced in the ovarian theca cells, also in adipose tissue, in muscle, adrenal glands, reabsorbed through enterohepatic recirculation. So there's a lot of different pockets of estrogen that you have to think about. This is my favorite diagram, and I literally have this laminated. There's a lot of things, slides in my talk you should laminate and show your patients. And I will say to them, okay, I know it's too much biochemistry, but let me just walk you through this. And I show it to them. I say, okay, you've got too much estrogen, and that's making these two chemicals, which are inflammation, and that makes this this enzyme called aromatase, and then that takes your testosterone and turns it into estrogen, and they go round and round and round, and they're going, okay. I said, and then if your insulin's off, it pushes the aromatase, and if your genetics are screwed up, that makes it worse. And actually on mine, I drew in cortisol interfering the insulin. And before their eyes glazed over, I go, well, okay, so the bad news is it's all connected. And they go, okay. And I go, and the good news is it's all connected. And they go, why is that a good thing? I said, because that gives you lots of different places to break the cycle. And that kind of helps them wrap their head around why I'm going to ask them to do certain things. So it's all about motivation. And most of the time, I find that if you can explain to people why you're asking them to do something, they'll do it for you. So this is basically a similar comment. I just wanted to bring to your attention that aromatase is elevated in fibroids, endometriosis, in that endometriotic implant, in breast cancer cells, and in the synovial fluid in rheumatoid arthritis. So not only, even if systemically her body may not be doing this feedback cycle to this extent, it may be happening within those areas as well, and you're not going to be able to pick it up in any kind of testing. So aromatase inhibitors, this is a new thing in your toolkit. Laminate it. Have it nearby. I photocopy it and give it to my patients all the time just to remind them of the simple things they can do in terms of food and supplements to keep the aromatase under control. Now, don't freak out about the details of this slide. The little orange arrows are simply to point out the parts of the ovarian steroidogenic pathway that are upregulated by insulin. Lots of different places. Just to remind you that pretty much every enzyme is impacted by insulin, so very important to help her keep her insulin under control. All right, so that being said, pop quiz. If aromatase is upregulated by inflammation, which I mentioned a minute ago, think of everything you learned in the past couple of days. Shout out to me what you can do about the inflammation's impact on the aromatase. Pop quiz. Come on, guys, wake up. What's going to fix this person's inflammation? Gut, yes. Sleep, good. Weight loss, stress. You guys are good. You have been learning.